So welcome everyone here to this evening's PEDtalk. My name is Christine Newbold. I'm Manager of Community Planning and GIS for the City of Hamilton, and I'm pleased to introduce our event this evening and moderate the discussion. We have a really good attendance this evening, and just as a show of hands, how many here are with their first PEDtalk? Oh, quite a few. That's great. Well, this is actually our 7th PEDtalk. And you might be wondering, for the new people here, what is a PEDtalk? So PEDtalks are free community events that are hosted by our Planning and Economic Development Department to bring together citizens, city staff, businesses, stakeholders to talk about important city building initiatives here in Hamilton. PEDtalks present a broader lens through which initiatives coming forward through the Planning and Economic Development Department can be viewed, and the intent is really to foster a greater understanding as well as thought-provoking discussion on the important issues and initiatives that affect Hamilton. So if anyone is following along on social media, the link into that is #PEDtalks. And I do want to take a few moments to acknowledge Councillor Farr and Councillor Pearson, who are with us today. And Councillor Pearson has not missed a PEDtalk yet. She has been here for all 7, so thank you very much for your support. And also to thank Joey Coleman, who is taping tonight's event, and it will be broadcast on the public record. That's thepublicrecord.ca, potentially next week. I know he has some logistics to work out himself there. But tonight we're really excited to bring you an opportunity to engage in a discussion about growth and change in our downtown. As our downtown is growing, and our city staff will be coming forward with a revised secondary plan for downtown that includes directions for tall building development. So to help frame that discussion and advance our understanding of urbanism, built form, and change, we're fortunate to have Ken Greenberg with us, as well as our chief planner here in Hamilton, Steve Robichaud. The format tonight will be a presentation by Ken, followed by a presentation by Steve, and Steve will be giving a brief overview of Hamilton's downtown secondary plan and the work on the tall buildings guidelines. And then we'll have a question and comment section after those presentations, where we will hopefully hear lots of great thought-provoking comments and discussions from everyone here in the audience. So as for logistics, I do need to mention that restrooms and a drinking fountain are located through the doors straight across the hallway. And if you're in need of assistance in any way, there are several staff around that can help. So to introduce our speakers, I'll start first with both Ken and Steve, and then we'll move right into the presentations. So welcome Ken Greenberg. Ken is an urban designer, teacher, and writer, and the former Director of Urban Design and Architecture for the City of Toronto, and principal of Greenberg Consultants. For over 4 decades, Ken has played a pivotal role on public and private assignments in urban settings throughout North America and Europe, focusing on the rejuvenation of downtowns, waterfronts, neighborhoods, and on-campus master planning, regional growth management, and new community planning. Cities as diverse as Amsterdam, Montreal, Detroit, and San Juan, Puerto Rico have benefited from his advocacy and passion for restoring the vitality and relevance and sustainability of the public realm in urban life. In each city, with each project, his strategic consensus-building approach has led to coordinated planning and a renewed focus on urban design. He is the recipient of the 2010 American Institute of Architects Thomas Jefferson Award for Public Design Excellence and the 2014 Sustainable Cities Building Lifetime Achievement Award. He's involved in many grassroots and community initiatives and is a board member of Park People, a nonprofit dedicated to the improvement of Toronto's parks. He's the co-founder and a visiting scholar at the new City Building Institute at Ryerson University in Toronto. A frequent writer for periodicals, he's the author of Walking Home, The Life and Lessons of a City Builder, published by Random House, and his current major project is as urban design lead and client representative for the project Under the Gardener in Toronto. So welcome, Ken. Now, Steve Robichaud is the Director of Planning and Chief Planner for the City of Hamilton. As Chief Planner, he oversees and provides leadership to the Planning Division, which includes long-range strategic planning, community planning, GIS, urban design, built and natural heritage, and the development approval functions in the city. Steve is the architect of the city's long-term growth management strategy, which is being implemented through a new official plan and the preparation of a new comprehensive zoning bylaw, as well as secondary plans and area studies for existing and new communities. Steve has led the division's Open for Business initiative through the creation of a business facilitation team to assist clients and lead a variety of continuous improvement initiatives. Steve is passionate about the role of policy, regulation, and design in creating places, neighborhoods, and communities that move Hamilton towards its vision for sustainable growth and community development. A registered professional planner with an undergraduate degree from McMaster University and a Master's of Science in Planning from the University of Toronto, Steve's a registered professional planner, and this fall was recognized by the Ontario Professional Planners Institute for his 25 years of service to the planning profession. So welcome, Steve. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ken, and he will start our presentations.
How to make it dance. There it is, okay.
And where's your
Slideshow.
There you go, sir.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm really pleased to be here for this PEDtalk. It's my first. And so thank you to Jason, Steve, the staff here in the city. And this is a really interesting time in the life of our cities in this country and around the world, in fact. And the question, with a pretty substantial return to the city that you're seeing here in Hamilton and elsewhere, is not so much whether to make it dense, but how to make it dense. And so that's really what I want to address today in this talk. By the way, in terms of the project Under the Gardener, let me just extend a little invitation. It's called the Bentway. That was a name selected through a public competition. We will be opening a 250-meter skating trail on artificial ice right next to Fort York at the end of the year, late December, and a formal opening with the mayor for his levee on January 6th. So I invite you all to pack up your skates and come for a skate in Toronto. So this move to the city is really a reflection of a paradigm shift that is happening that is as powerful as the one that happened right after World War II, when we all fell in love with automobiles and moved out to the suburbs. And the Urban Land Institute, which is probably the most prestigious and respected organization of the development industry, issued this report in 2013 to its members, alerting them to the fact that what people are looking for now, especially the younger cohorts in the population, is compact, walkable places, and that they should really be aware that the kinds of development they're doing should be addressing that need. This is a kind of action-reaction. If the so-called North American dream looked like what you see at the left, it was having a house and a garden and a fleet of automobiles for every adult in the family. This is a very modest one with a single-car garage. We've got up to 3-car garages and additional cars in the driveway. What younger people are looking for now, increasingly, is a very different competing dream, which reflects an entirely different set of priorities, and it's being able to walk to buy your groceries, have access to transit, be able to get places on a bicycle. And what's really fascinating is that between age 16 and 34 in North America, 26% of that age cohort does not have a driver's license. This is an astonishing change, Certainly when I was 16, one of the first things I did was race to get my license, and I'm sure that was true for many of you in the audience. So this is a very significant change that's happening. So it's pushing us to get denser and denser in cities, and as you've probably seen if you travel down the QE to Toronto, we have an amazing number of very high buildings that are going up. But as I say here, we have to be careful when we focus on these buildings one at a time, that we're looking at each tree in isolation and we're missing the forest. And so it's really not a question of how dense we make it per se, although that's an important question, but as I said at the beginning, how are we making it dense? And we're going through a transitional period, and these are the stops along the Yonge subway line at Yonge and Eglinton, Yonge St. Clair, Yonge Davisville, where we have only two typologies. We have these high-rise slabs, and these are from a couple of decades ago mostly. There's some more recent ones, and then you have single-family houses surrounding them. And we've kind of missed something in this reduction of the buildings we're creating to these two scales. In fact, there are choices, and as was mentioned, I've done a lot of work in Amsterdam. I was an advisor to the city of Amsterdam for 3.5 years along the River Eye, which is the main axis along which the city is situated. And for the most part, as you probably know, Amsterdam has not had high-rise buildings. And there's now a very active debate going on this one piece of territory called Zeeburg. And the question is whether they should go to a more North American-like format, which you see at the top with these high-rise buildings. But what's interesting is the two images you see there have exactly the same amount of density, the same amount of housing units. And so this hasn't been resolved yet, but it really points to the fact that we do have choices. It's not inevitable that the only way to house people, whether employees in office buildings or in residential, is in high-rise buildings. In fact, we have to be very careful about some of the unforeseen consequences of building too high, particularly in smaller and medium-sized cities, when we have a return in interest in coming to the heart of the city, and we soak up all the density in a few high-rise buildings, and we end up for long periods of time with this kind of sea of parking lots. So Jason and I were recently in Winnipeg. You're looking over the Forks here, the famous confluence of the rivers, and what you see is a few high-rise buildings, but the experience walking around downtown Winnipeg, and I dare say this has some echoes in Hamilton and other cities, is of still being surrounded by all these parking lots. And it's pretty clear that if you took that same amount of absorption and you were to spread it around onto more sites in a less dense extreme form, you would be doing more city building more quickly. There's also in our system in Ontario with market value assessment, there's another unintended consequence. MPAC, our provincial agency which does market value assessment, bases the value of properties and the taxes on recent sales in any given area. That's how they come to an appraisal. And so when you have a speculative real estate market where the land value is based on people assuming they can build very high buildings, what happens is the taxes on lower buildings end up being based on the assumption that not the use that's currently on the site, but that they too could be similar high-rise buildings. So we had a famous case at 401 Richmond. This is a building on the edge of Spadina Avenue. where we had a lot of really interesting cultural industries being housed in this building, and the taxes were being driven up to the point where all those uses were on the verge of being forced out of the building, because MPAC was saying this should be a tower like the one you see in the background of the photograph, and was taxing the building accordingly. This became such a scandal that the province and the city actually stepped in and created a special taxing category for cultural uses to make an exception for this building. But that one-off solution is not necessarily a solution generally. So these last 2 points about absorption and about the impact on market value assessment are important to bear in mind. This is Jane Jacobs, who brilliantly predicted in 1992 what would happen with market value assessment, and made a really strong argument that the way we were applying it in Ontario could have devastating consequences. And essentially, I'll just read part of this. What I worry about is the effects of this on small business, in particular, by which not only retail trade, which is part of it, but also the many suppliers of goods and services to their enterprises, which are one of the things that make the city so economically important, so viable, and such a producer of jobs. And she was predicting exactly what we have come to understand, that the rise in taxes based on a speculative land value based on these extremely high buildings would in fact drive out a lot of the existing users and the smaller businesses. So the first thing I want to say, and I'm going to come back to high-rise buildings later, but they're not the only answer, as I showed you in that example from Amsterdam. There is a whole movement now that has emerged around what's called the missing middle, buildings that fall between those 2 scales that I showed you along the Yonge subway line. And in fact, there's a whole range of typologies that are extremely useful in city building and actually make for great cities. So everything from courtyard apartments, townhouse, row house, mid-rise apartment houses, fourplexes, duplexes, stacked townhouses, all of these typologies actually deployed over large areas of the city can house a lot of people and can actually make great improvements to the fabric of the city. And so we're starting to see an interest in this, and the City Building Institute that I'm part of has done some surveys, and again, a phrase that you may be becoming familiar with, which is gentle density, as opposed to radical and cataclysmic density, is supported by 84% of Ontarians in surveys that we've done. They actually would like to see this kind of density come into their communities as they grow and prosper and improve. So there's very strong public interest in and support for this. We also have, somewhat recently, some changes to the Ontario Building Code, which allow for what's called tall wood frame construction, up to 7 stories when you build on top of 1 concrete slab for a base for commercial uses. So again, this is a very economical way of building. A lot of the developers were reluctant to build at this scale when they had to build concrete buildings. It was not efficient for them to build elevator buildings in concrete at this scale, but all of a sudden when you can build in frame, it starts to make sense. So in addition, as another component of that missing middle, laneway suites. We're in Toronto, we now have studies underway to make laneway housing as of right throughout the city. Vancouver has already done this, and this is a photograph of some of your lanes in Hamilton. You have 818 laneways in the city. We have about 2,500 in Toronto. A tremendous amount of additional housing can be created, and the idea behind laneway suites essentially is this would be rental housing. It would not involve severing the lots. Typically, it's 2 stories. It can be workshops. It can be what are called granny flats. It can be combined with garages at grade level. Vancouver has had great success in introducing this, and there are now some prototypes in Toronto that are starting to get off the ground, and it's pretty clear that this has a lot of support from our city council. Secondary suites. Jason, do you already have permission for secondary suites? Okay, well this, again, is a very useful form of housing. So if you look at the missing middle and you start to look at all these components and different types, a lot of densification can occur in terms of addition of people living and working in the city without necessarily reverting to high-rise. However, high-rise is a reality. So the rest of what I'm going to say is when you do build high, what should you be thinking about? And if you look at this image of Toronto, the existing and proposed, we have this extraordinary vertical explosion of the city. But my real focus, and the focus of many people now, is on not just building one building at a time, but how do you build sustainable neighborhoods in a high-rise format where this is occurring? How do you get a mix of living and work? How do you get great streets, great pedestrian spaces? How do you get shopping and services for the entire population? How do you get affordable housing mixed into this? We're about to adopt inclusionary zoning in Toronto. I wish we had done it 15 years ago, 20 years ago. We would have had thousands and thousands of units of affordable housing. But nonetheless, looking forward, this is where we're heading. So this is what's to be avoided. This is near the mouth of the Humber. This very unfortunate sign by a developer who was obviously clueless, advertising a private enclave, and you get these individual buildings. For those of you who've seen this little area, there's no plan, there's virtually no amenities, no services, even though it's right by the beautiful Humber Bay Shores Park. And now, after quite a few of these buildings have been built, they're trying to play catch up. They're trying to ex post facto introduce those features into the neighborhood which have been missing. The key to all of this is walkability. And how many people here have used WalkScore? Okay, well, you've made the point. When people are making decisions about where to live, where to work, where to open a business, you open up WalkScore and you can see what's around you within a 5-minute walk, a 10-minute walk. And when you visit another city, this is a great way to see where you would like to go. This happens to be a piece of Vancouver. So the combination of living and working, to take one issue, the 1 + 1 = 3 is really evident in this neighborhood in Malmö, Sweden, where you see those 2 buildings on the upper left side by side. The curtain wall building is office, beside it is a residential building, and on the ground floor where you see those canopies is a little cafe. That cafe could not exist if you took away either the residential or the employment. It actually can function because you have a live-in population, you have people there in the evening, you have people there during the day. In other words, you have a variety of clientele. So this is an example. Retail, successful grade level retail, thrives when you have people living and working. This is fascinating. Even Walmart, if you can believe this, has come up with a version of themselves which is a shop under an apartment building. So this is in Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington. Instead of the familiar Walmart that you see up on top, this is a very elegant little Walmart tucked into the base of a residential building. Policy is extremely important in all this. I recall here in the 1970s, the Central Area Plan in Toronto, which was done at a time when we couldn't persuade the development industry, if you can believe that, to build any residential downtown. All the industry wanted to build was office buildings, and the city created a policy which said to get the highest and best use of your land, you had to build mixed use. And of course the pendulum has swung the other way, and now we have to emphasize employment as part of that mixed use. The residential demand has become so strong. So when I first started working for the City of Toronto, I was recruited by David Crombie at the time. My first assignment was working in this area. You may recognize the Flatiron Building near St. Lawrence Market. It was the proverbial sea of parking lots. The parking lots have all but disappeared on the right. It's all been filled with mostly mid-rise housing, employment uses. The market is thriving now. This has become a truly mixed neighborhood, and with all of the affordable housing, co-ops, and Toronto Community Housing, and so on in the St. Lawrence neighborhood itself, it has a great mix of tenures and price points for the whole population. I'm going to describe another great experiment that I was involved in with Mayor Barbara Hall and Jane Jacobs, by the way, in 1997, called the King Spadina and King Parliament, the 400 acres on both sides of downtown, where formerly there had been industrial zoning and where we made a change in that year to take away all land use zoning and allow for a complete mix of uses with only built form controls. And so what has happened in that area has been this layering of huge numbers of additional people living and working in this neighborhood. This is very near where I live, and all the darker gray are new buildings that have come in amongst the older mercantile and warehouse buildings in the area, adding a tremendous amount of population. Since that bylaw was changed, 50,000 new housing units have been created in King Parliament and King Spadina, and thousands and thousands of jobs. And what's so interesting, you can't read the little graph on the right, but all of those bars that are above the line are new economy uses that have come in. At the far right, traditional manufacturing, which has declined, obviously. We don't have factories, traditional factories there anymore. But the fascinating thing is, along with the 50,000 housing units, there are more people working in King Spadina and King Parliament than ever did during the height of the industrial era. So that this is really a tribute to the fact that employers are looking for residents are looking for places to work that they can walk to. This is really what people are seeking in cities nowadays. So this is from my window, looking over Victoria Memorial Square, and you see this mix of new buildings and old buildings in this part of King Spadina, largely in a mid-rise format. And this has become an extraordinary neighborhood. And what I love about it is, and this is a pure Jane Jacobs story, when I walk out the door, almost weekly, monthly, all these kinds of new businesses are springing up, new enterprises, people experimenting, trying things. This is just to give you a flavor. Even Loblaws jumps into the act, and like the Walmart image that I've showed, they built a store with very little parking. There's some parking underground, which people hardly use. Most people walk to the store. And the actual Loblaws is on the second floor. They have ground level shops at street level, and they have housing above. So this is this paradigm shift that I'm describing. Beyond the repurposing and individual lots, we're getting new development now where 3 developers who did different things have combined to do mixed use. So we have RioCan, I don't know if they're active in Hamilton, a major commercial developer, teaming up with Allied Properties, which is a REIT that very successful at doing offices, teaming up with Diamond Core doing residential, and Tridel is now part of it, becoming a 4th partner. And they're developing this scheme on 7 acres with 8 little pedestrian blocks with mixed use in all the blocks. So there will be people living, working, there will be a public daycare, there'll be parks, there'll be all of those amenities on site. The City of Toronto is taking really important initiatives to recognize that a lot of young families are now raising kids in this vertical city. And so how do you outfit these buildings from the individual dwelling unit to playgrounds, to daycare, to what happens in the vicinity of the building so that they serve a complete life cycle? So people, instead of seeing this as transitional housing for people who are going to, when they start to have kids, move out to the suburbs, people are not moving out to the suburbs. They want to be where the action is. They don't want to have long commutes. They want the convenience of living in the city. So we're having both the development industry and the city now paying a great deal of attention to how to make these vertical neighborhoods kid-friendly, among other things. So this shift from individual buildings to sustainable neighborhoods has really been the basis of my work with private sector development and with policy development for cities. And so it comes down to the things I've kind of noted here in these bullets. How to add shared space in increments to the public realm as the development occurs. How to improve linkages and networks. How to add amenities, services, both commercial and social, cultural spaces that are free and accessible. How to create those, what we call third places, where people, it's neither where they work nor where they live, but it's places where people gather and assemble. How do you make these developments extroverted, where they extend invitations to surrounding development, to the neighborhood context? How do you do this while you're enhancing active transportation options, walking and cycling? And how do you address the full needs of the entire community, different abilities, different ages, different incomes? These are really the fundamental objectives we should be thinking about. So I'm going to show you quickly a bunch of projects I've been involved in over the years that actually exhibit these characteristics. This is in Cambridge, Massachusetts, on the edge of the MIT campus. I got involved with a really successful developer who was dealing with life science labs. And he purchased a site, a former coal gasification site, 6 acres near the Charles River. And he said to me, my instruction was, the last thing I want to do is a science park, because the top level scientists that we want to attract here want to be part of an active city. They don't want to walk out of their building and be in a homogeneous science park. So he said, I would like you to make this, and he was being funny, but he was speaking to the mix. He said, I would like this to be a train wreck. And so this is what it was before. We divided the site into 6 little blocks, strong pedestrian orientation. In terms of linkages, it became a major crossroads at Kendall Square on the edge of the Charles River with flow-throughs for local community people. These are the 6 blocks. So we have labs, we have residential, we have hotel, we have small boat launching on the Charles River, we have restaurants, we have cafes, we have live entertainment. All of these things are part of the mix. And the public space includes a square which converts into a skating rink in winter, and it has become an extremely lively place, but more importantly, it offers a lot of amenities to the people in the surrounding East Cambridge neighborhood who welcome this addition, and it's become a kind of template. So there you see another image of that square. So in that building, you have some of the top scientists in the world working. They come out of their building and they're in that public space, and they can be with others, they can have a coffee, they can put on their skates in winter. This is a project in Toronto which is currently under construction. The Daniels Corporation, well-known developer, again, I'm not sure whether they're active in Hamilton, is building something called the Waterfront City of the Arts. And in terms of mix, this is probably one of the greatest examples I've been involved in. It has several forms of residential. It has office. It has what's called the Artscape Launchpad, where 1,000 artists will actually have a chance to work. It has a cultural accelerator. It has a black box theater. It has restaurants. It has cafes. And it has George Brown College as components of this. So it has a 24-hour life. We estimated, and the number would be higher today, that there would be a daytime population of about 7,300 people, and people sleeping on the site, about 2,500. And what's crucial is there's a shared public space, which is part of a network along the waterfront, where all of these people of different ages doing different things would actually congregate and meet. This is one in South Boston that I'm currently working on. It's the transformation of the Boston Edison power plant. There's another in Toronto called the Abattoir, a third at Church and Wellesley, and one at King West in Toronto. I'm just going to show these quickly. May run a few minutes over, but bear with me. This is this iconic power plant in South Boston. If you saw the movie Good Will Hunting with Matt Damon, this is where it took place. This is the famous Southie neighborhood. And so it sits in a really interesting location in the industrial waterfront. Here you see it here. But the first thing we looked at with the team was all the things we could connect to in the surrounding area. It also has this magnificent 200-meter long turbine hall, which we're turning into a shared public space. And around it, we're building 17 acres of mixed-use development, residential, office, retail, cultural uses, the same kind of mix as the Daniels Corporation is doing. We're taking advantage of all the industrial artifacts to make some really interesting spaces along the edge of the river. And these are some images of the kind of environment that we'll be creating. There's been very strong public engagement. In that South Boston neighborhood was famous for hating everything. And we had some really successful meetings with the community because we were giving a lot back to the community, things that they were missing, things that they needed. This is the Abattoir in Toronto. This was the old slaughterhouse established in the early part of the 20th century on what was then the edge of the city. It's just on the west side of Bathurst Street on Tecumseh. This is the site. I'm working with a development company called TAS. This is on the alignment of the old Garrison Creek that flowed into Toronto Harbor. It's right next to Fort York. And so the idea here has been to build this web of connections with adjoining developments, with the Bentway projects that I'm working on with Fort York. And at the heart of this, at grade level, is a commitment to all these really interesting programs, sort of fulfilling the aspirations that I was describing. So recreation for seniors, childcare, a culture hub, mixes, gathering places, a food market. All of these things become part of the development. These are some images which we shared as part of a community process. We developed this plan with the community. We started the engagement with the community without a plan. And we essentially came to this by starting with principles and building toward a scheme. This is an image, Church and Wellesley, almost there. This is right in the heart of the gay village. This is a site at Church and Wellesley. This is with an architectural firm from Copenhagen, 3XN, One Properties, the developer from Edmonton. And so it was really about the gay village repositioning itself for a new generation of development, thinking ahead. And I worked with the community on a prior study called The State of the Village. And some of the things that were important were the quality of street life on Church Street. And we really put a focus on that corner and especially what would happen in the lower levels of the building. And so with 3XN, we developed a whole series of alternatives for public spaces to be shared with the 519 Community Center in the base of the building. And if you look at the lower image on the right, there's a space not unlike what you have in this building in the lobby, a community gathering space. And here's an image of that with a restaurant, cafe above it. Last example, King West. This is a project I'm doing with another Danish architectural firm, Big, Bjarke Engels, and his group. This is with Allied Properties and with Westbank from Vancouver. And so the idea here was to add to the lexicon of public facilities and public spaces emerging in this part of King Spadina, to add new community facilities, new cultural facilities along a trajectory where other developers, each new development is being asked by the councillor and by the community to contribute a piece of the public infrastructure. That's part of the deal for getting development approvals. And this is what's interesting about this scheme. It's not a high-rise tower, but it's very dense. So this is kind of Moshe Safdie's habitat comes to an urban site where a huge number of the units will actually have these beautiful outdoor terraces. The final thing I want to say is that you can combine the middle and the high-rise buildings when you do precinct planning, when instead of looking at one small site at a time, you actually look at a whole area. So I don't know how many of you have visited what was the Athletes Village for the Pan Am Games, west side of downtown, a few. You really should go and have a look at this. This is a great combination with a few high-rise buildings, mostly mid-rise buildings, great public spaces. Another example is East Bayfront. This is where that Daniels project, City of the Arts, is growing. Again, Waterfront Toronto has been doing terrific precinct planning. So the point is there's a place for high-rise buildings, but in the context of a much more complex development picture. My last slide is a collage that I put together of your city. And I just grabbed a bunch of plans that were all online of things that are happening close to where we are today. And my point with this is rather than looking at one development application at a time, what you really need to be doing is looking at this total emerging picture, looking at what's missing in terms of those amenities, services, public spaces, and seeing how you can leverage a wave of development to actually add to a bigger picture that the city will guide and the neighborhoods will guide for this redevelopment. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Ken. We'll have Steve come up now and offer some remarks about the downtown secondary plan and our work we're doing on that project.
Thank you, Christine, and thank you, Ken. I just would like to recognize that both Councillor Farr is here tonight, as well as Jason Thorne as the General Manager of Planning, and I want to thank Jason for organizing tonight and giving me the opportunity to talk about the great work that we've been doing on the downtown secondary plan. So over the last 30 to 50 years, we've seen a changing paradigm within the downtown and within planning within the central area. Up until through the 1960s and the 1970s, it was sort of based on the central area plan and the tower and the park model. The official plan, the policies, the neighborhood plan, and the zoning encouraged and promoted this form of development. There was bonusing was built into the zoning bylaw so that where additional landscaping was being provided or additional non-residential gross floor area that exceeded the building code requirements, developers and builders would receive an increase in the gross floor area for providing that sort of outdoor amenity space or amenity space within the building. That model was also based on a concentric zone theory that sort of was a series of rings around the downtown with the most dense or the tallest buildings being within the downtown core area. And as you sort of gravitated out from sort of King and James area, you would actually start seeing lower heights and lower densities. And that actually zoning was in place that started in the 1950s, and that zoning remained in force and effect until 2005 when the new zoning was adopted for the downtown secondary plan area. And there are still remnants of this zoning in place today within the Durand neighborhoods, Kirkendall, Beasley, and the Strathcona neighborhoods. In the late 1990s, we went through a series of economic changes within the city of Hamilton. Part of that was related to the free trade, NAFTA. There was the deindustrialization, and there was sort of a shift, and there was the continued, which resulted in a change and a refocus and a rethinking about the way the planning would occur for the downtown. That came out to culminated in the new secondary plan for the downtown, which was sort of putting people first, which really looked at achieving density through lot coverage as opposed to necessarily achieving tall buildings. So we had a series of development occurred within the downtown. It was essentially 100% lot coverage, low to mid-rise buildings such as this one that was built on Main Street, and it really it implemented what that secondary plan envisioned. That was held well till about 5 years ago, when suddenly the city saw another shift or another paradigm shift within the development approvals process, which was really a combination of the tower in the park and the putting people in place model, where it was a podium 2 to 3 stories in height with a high-rise tower on top of that. The official plan policies in force and effect at that time did not contemplate that form of development. The zoning didn't contemplate that form of development, but we saw developers coming forward saying that if the middle model was acceptable, so why can't I build the middle model and then put a 30 or 40-story tower on top of that? So we decided as a department that we needed to update our secondary plan policies, review our zoning regulations, as well as come up with tall building guidelines. When the first of these 2 projects came forward to our design review panel, we realized we had a huge vacuum. We had no real strong mechanism for evaluating these sorts of tall buildings within downtown Hamilton, and because of that, there was a real strong need to re-energize and get moving forward again on the downtown secondary plan update. So as I said, there's been a series of recent development applications throughout the downtown, and that there's a very, very sudden shift. It was literally like overnight that somebody just threw a light switch on, and then we were receiving numerous inquiries, applications. Some were going to the Committee of Adjustment, some were coming in as site plans, some were coming in as formal consultation applications. We had the Royal Connaught, which has up to 36 meters in height for a future tower, the Connolly at 98 James Street, Bella Towers at Main Street, 150 Main Street West, the Tivoli condominium application. In addition, we have the applications we're currently processing on Jackson Street, the old CHCH site, the Kresge site, which is currently working its way through the development review process, George Street, which is a building currently under construction right now, Queen and King Street. We had the recent council approval of that rezoning application. Main and Walnut, we have a current application in, King and Caroline, and then the William Thomas building. So we knew we actually had to deal with this somehow and get in front of this trend and provide a policy framework and an evaluation framework to deal with these applications. So under the leadership of Christine and Alyssa Mahood, we re-engage the community in terms of the downtown secondary plan, developing some urban design guidelines to deal with these buildings, developing tall building guidelines, and consulted both through the general community liaison committee, as well as our design review panel and the development industry liaison group. As a result of this consultation, we released a draft secondary plan before Christmas, and most recently we updated the draft secondary plan and released the final version on October 20th, which has new policies and new height schedules and other and a framework for evaluating tall buildings within the downtown. What we did here was very clear. Quality of development was important. It's not only just where tall buildings are constructed, but how they are constructed, their sense of context, fit, and how they relate to the community. The idea that new development should make a positive contribution to both the streetscape and the city, and that also we should be looking at our tall building guidelines to ensure that we recognize best practices. One of the issues was to ensure that new development can occur, but also to balance that not every site can develop. So there was a bit of concern about that if one site could develop, meeting the best practices in terms of tall building guidelines and building separations, would that sterilize other sites from having that opportunity to develop and being able to put together some minimum standards. This was sort of building on the work when we did the mobility study for the James GO station, where the consultants came back and said, because of the land ownership pattern in the city of Hamilton, not every site can support a tall building. And until you address some of those issues, or land assembly occurs, or other preconditions are met, then those sites should not develop for taller buildings. We also heard that there were some very special areas within the city of Hamilton, the Gore, King William Street, James Street North, and Hess Village, and that these areas should be protected. Again, not every site is available for a tall building or redevelopment. There were other areas in the city that could support more heightened development than what was originally proposed, either in the current downtown secondary plan or some of the earlier drafts, in particular along Cannon Street and Main Street, and that the view of the escarpment is an important concept. New buildings should not be taller than the escarpment. This is a long-standing planning concept that's been in the city of Hamilton. It dates back through ongoing discussions. I remember in the early 1990s talking about the height of the escarpment and that being an organizing and a shaping feature for how the downtown develops, but it's never sort of been translated into a policy framework. And again, tall is a relative concept. The building must be appropriately located in terms of the surrounding context. So what we heard, very loud, was that the Hamilton escarpment is a very important element in the psyche of Hamiltonians. Not only is it where you live, but it's where you come from. You come from Hamilton Mountain, or you come from the lower city, and that the views of the escarpment should be protected, both looking at the escarpment from the lake and then looking from the top of the escarpment towards the lake. So given that, we developed a mission statement essentially for the updated downtown secondary plan. And that new buildings should respect the city's unique topography, including the landscape, including the Niagara Escarpment and the waterfront. So the next task then was to translate that into the tall building framework for the city of Hamilton. So with the tall building guidelines, we developed a series of principles. Those principles both build upon the current urban Hamilton official plan, urban design and intensification policies, as well as throughout the community consultation. The principles deal with the fact that the siting, the setting, the locational context, as well as making sure that those buildings recognize what's there today, as well as what's also being planned, and that we leverage other public investments such as with LRT in taking advantage of where we locate tall buildings. In terms of looking at how we deal with this, we've developed sort of 4 general criteria, or 4 building typologies. We have low-rise buildings, mid-rise buildings, point towers, and a hybrid, where you may find a mid-rise and a tall building all located on the same site, recognizing that they have different heights, different setbacks, different lot coverage requirements, different lot frontage requirements, and different performance standards associated with those building types. We also knew that there were certain areas in the city that, like we indicated, those special character areas. Some of these areas may not lend themselves to, or the new intensification and redevelopment should respect what is there today, and other areas could support higher densities and more development and redevelopment opportunities within the downtown secondary plan area. We then decided to say, if a site meets those requirements and it is eligible for consideration for a tall building, then what are the important considerations? We want to make sure that the building speaks to the street. Although it seems very common sense, when looking at development applications, very often we see the buildings turning their backs to the streets for a variety of reasons. It may simply be that they're trying to maximize unit yield. It may be the layout of the underground parking structure, or maybe you just simply can't figure out where the front door is located on that building, or essentially it's a building that's being designed somewhere else and it's being replicated here in the city of Hamilton. And that's one of the important criteria. The massing of the building is important in that it shouldn't overwhelm the sidewalk or the pedestrian environment, and it should also respect the existing character of the area or the planned character for the area. Heritage buildings are an important consideration throughout both designated and non-designated heritage buildings. We want to ensure that the new buildings where we do have designated heritage buildings or recognized heritage buildings within the downtown, that the design doesn't overpower those buildings. We don't move into a situation of a simple facadomy, or you lose that sort of what's important, what people value within downtown city of Hamilton, and any open space areas that help provide a sense of separation and distinction between new development and old development. We've been looking at with building setbacks in terms of minimums and maximum setbacks. Those are currently within the zoning bylaw, and further building on those, and that requiring that those sort of setbacks essentially allow for both the base of the building and then any sort of top of the building within that podium and the tower component of it. And that's all intended to help ensure that we provide for an animated frontage along the street edge. We've seen development proposals where essentially it's just the first floor would be a parking garage that doesn't actually contribute to a very attractive streetscape, or they're turning their back to the streetscape, or also when looking at it when designing a residential building, if you're going to have residential at grade, the way that that residential relates to the street is different than if you have commercial. And how do you design that into it? The idea that if you it should be a front porch condition along the street as opposed to a backyard. Often what we see is that we have residential units at grade. People are expecting to use that amenity space in the same way you would in a suburban rear yard, and then you get pressure to put up a large, either to raise up that residential area, put in fences, other visual barriers, and then you've actually created a reverse lotting frontage situation like you would have in Upper Wellington or Upper Wentworth or on Rymal Road. So those residential units do not relate to the street. So the idea is that it should be a front porch along the street if it's not for ground-related non-residential type uses. I can recall when I was going to school, when the bank towers were being constructed, there were all sorts of issues in downtown Toronto with wind. People literally couldn't get to the front of some of the buildings because of the wind condition. So that's why canopies are an important consideration. How are we dealing with wind issues and mitigating wind issues and creating an environment along the streetscape that people aren't literally being blown over on windy days? Views are also important in terms of strategic views. We have been looking at doing a view shed analysis, looking at what views do we want to protect. What views are important? Views along the arterials, the main streets, as well as views from the escarpment, views looking towards the downtown, and then how does that building fit within that context? And then finally setbacks and dealing with issues of angular plane, minimizing sun shadow impacts, and ensuring that that new building is sympathetic in terms of its locational context. So given all of those considerations, like I indicated a couple of weeks ago, we updated the draft of the downtown secondary plan, and this is the schedule that was released on October 20th. I keep wanting to say 13th. And this map shows, the blue shows those areas where we've now identified would be suitable for a maximum of 30 stories in height. The purple is for 20 stories, the yellow would be for 12 stories, the pink would be for 8 stories, and there's areas that are being a maximum height of 3 stories. These would be the maximum planning permissions that would be allowed under the downtown secondary plan, and that any change from those maximum planning permissions would trigger the need for an official plan amendment. Notwithstanding, though, we want to make it very clear in terms of the vision within the downtown secondary plan is that these heights are the heights that we would like to, that we're expecting to see implemented, as opposed to the current policy framework that says, notwithstanding the height schedule, if you do a sun shadow study and a wind study that shows there's no impacts, then there is no maximum cap in the current downtown secondary plan provision. So this represents a bit of a significant policy shift that allows the municipality to shape and sculpt the downtown, provide for a good mixture of building forms within the downtown, meet our provincial planning, or actually exceed provincial planning objectives, both in terms of density and then opportunities for population and jobs within the downtown, and still provide for a degree of flexibility to allow for development to occur that is sympathetic and contextually correct within the downtown. I think what's missing from this slide, and as I was listening to Ken talk, was how does this also fit in within the broader community? To the north, we have the setting sail secondary plan area, which is generally a low to a mid-rise area. To the east and the west, again, is planned predominantly for low to mid-rise buildings. And then as we move into Durand, we have existing zoning, which does allow for some high-rise buildings, but we're also taking a look as part of how does that then fit within that area to ensure that we're planning for those full range and continuum of housing types. So we do see individuals that are looking at doing those low-rise buildings, the mid-rise buildings, and then directing the high-rise buildings to within the downtown, which provides a much clearer policy direction on a go-forward basis. So with that, thank you very much.
Okay, so we're going to open it up now for questions from the audience, but to kick off the questions, I'm going to ask each of our speakers to respond to the first question, which I had to choose, which was great. So Ken spoke of how to build good density and how built form in cities around the world is evolving. Steve spoke of Hamilton's progression in planning over the last 20, 30 years and in our downtown, as well as the city's proposed approach to tall buildings through policy, regulation, and design. So to each of you, from your individual roles and experiences in shaping the design and development of cities, what elements of built form, urban change, or policy direction resonate most positively with citizens in your experience, in your careers?
Okay, so good.
It's not working.
Is this working? I'll use this. It's a good question. There is a new acronym which I will give credit to the residents in Mimico for, which is going viral in Toronto, and it's called OCTIMBI. OCTIMBI means only good things in my backyard. This, as opposed to YIMBY, yes in my backyard, or NIMBY, not in my backyard. What it means is a critical look at what is the development going to contribute to make my life better. And two things I would say in answer to your question. One is we have to get beyond the narrow quantitative discussion of heights and densities to the qualitative discussion of what this wave of development is going to contribute to the life of the city, which takes us into a whole new range of issues, some of which can be dealt with by zoning bylaws, and some of which go way beyond the traditional purview of zoning bylaws. And I was trying to stress all those programmatic issues, because because Toronto, I think, has been experiencing this phenomenon a little bit longer than you have, and we were getting really concerned that we were just getting these, whatever shape or size, these filing cabinets for people that really weren't addressing the full set of needs of communities and the city. That's why I was emphasizing so much the mix of living and working, the mix of different tenure forms, the community amenities that you could leverage through development and so on. So I think getting to a broader understanding of place as opposed to just a statistical analysis of what's going on. The second thing is engaging the communities, the neighborhoods, in the development of schemes. So every single one of these things, the schemes that I showed you, essentially started with a process of community engagement that began in some cases before the architects were hired, and involved the local community in an understanding of the needs, an understanding of the relationships, beyond the formal statutory process that you have to go through when you amend the zoning or committee of adjustment application, getting people involved in talking about their neighborhoods, talking about what they need, how this new development will fit in, is something that the smart developers have realized makes their projects better. And the ones who do that hardly ever go to the OMB. They actually end up getting faster approvals than the ones who just try and ram it through the process. And so we have a whole generation of pretty savvy developers who are becoming really good at working with local communities. So those are, it's making it real and tangible in terms of what is it going to offer me to make my life better when this happens? And what are the things, from the standpoint of citizens, what should I be looking for in development?
So building on what Ken was saying, I always remind staff that density without design equals disaster. So good planning does not equal good architecture. Good architecture doesn't equal good planning, but the challenge is for good planning to create a framework that allows for good architecture to occur. So I think that's one of the things that's important. What does it look like? It's surprising how many people will start off with an application process and they just want to have this sketch or a blob, and they're saying the community will not accept that. They want to know what it's going to look like, and they're going to want to hold the developer to those commitments. The second thing, building on that, is that once a plan is being developed and prepared and developed by the community, they want the developers or the property owners to stick to that plan. And I think the province is now moving that way on secondary plans to say, we shouldn't spend 5 years developing a secondary plan, having the discussions, the debates, and reaching a consensus and an agreement to move forward, and then the day after council adopts that secondary plan for an application to come in that has no relationship to what was being developed by the community or proposed by the community and accepted by the community. And then the other issue, and we've always encouraged people, is to consult with the community as early as possible in the process. People don't like to react to receiving a notice in the mail saying an application is being made for a 40-story building in your backyard. That's a conversation that should start as early as possible with the neighborhood association, the ward councillor, and the affected residents to go through that consultation process, and then just make the application once you've reached sort of consensus as to what that application is going to look like. I think that's the other major aspect that the community is seeking as well. In addition to, we are now moving into that realm of community benefits. Inclusionary zoning, the new growth plan talks about providing for a full range of housing types, not just 50 square meter bachelor apartments, but looking at providing from bachelor apartments up to 3-bedroom apartments to meet all of the community needs as well on a housing continuum.
I just add one more thing. You're probably all aware of the legislation that the province is bringing in to change the OMB into this new tribunal. one of the effects of that is cities will have much greater power to actually make plans and live by them, as opposed to feeling that developers can come in and ignore the plans, go straight to the board, and get the city's plans overturned. And so this will make a great deal of difference. It means that you can do real planning without, it's not that there won't be any appeal process, there will still be something, but it will be nowhere near as unpredictable and subject to abuse as we're currently living through with the OMB.
Okay, thank you. We'll open it up to the floor here. Questions?
Hi, I'm Gary Smith, living in Ward 1. My question is for Ken, and it's purposely a naive question. I, and I think many others, believe that developers are basically rapacious. What is a reasonable rate of return that a developer would receive? Because everything I've heard described today as your function and the city's function operating like it's sort of a sea anchor. The sea anchor goes down and makes the ship steer into the wind. And what's a reasonable rate of return for that?
A reasonable rate of return, is that what you were saying? You know, it's hard to say because developers, depending on the nature of their business, they have very different time frames in which they look at return on investment. So there are some developers, a certain type of condo developer who is looking to get in and out as quickly as possible. They have bridge financing. They're going to sell the units and get off the site. But increasingly, there are other developers who take a much longer term view and are building value. You know, a fascinating thing that's happening, I don't know if you're starting to get more rental housing as opposed to condos. Okay, well, the thing about rental buildings, and this may surprise you, the rental buildings typically are better built than the condos. Why? Because the people who will own those buildings have to manage them. They're spending a lot more thought on energy consumption, on the construction of the buildings, on the maintainability of the buildings. Their return on investment occurs over a much longer period of time. You have a difference between family-run companies where they actually have control versus the ones who are responding to shareholders, who are asking them to emphasize the profit motive above all very quickly. But what I will say, I'm not going to give you a number, but I will say that in my experience now in Toronto, the majority of developers are becoming much more sophisticated city builders, and they're taking on a lot, and this is why I pointed out so many of them I'm working for now, who hire me because they want to A, work with communities, and B, they're interested in this longer notion of social sustainability, environmental sustainability, doing better projects. That said, there are a handful of rogue developers, I would call them, bad actors, and we have a fascinating situation in my neighborhood now. I've never seen this before, where a few of these have come into the neighborhood knowing that the rules are going to change, and they've tried to ram through some pretty ridiculous proposals, and the more responsible developers in the neighborhood have actually joined the community association, and they're going to help us fight them at the OMB. So they're putting their money on the table, they're putting their reputations on the table because they think these bad actors are actually ruining the reputation of the industry. So that's a pretty interesting kind of phenomenon, but it speaks to what I think is a change in the ethos around development.
I have a question. Thank you very much for your presentations, and I wanted to pick up on something that Ken talked about as a really key ingredient to sustainable neighborhoods, and that is walkability, and people wanting compact, walkable neighborhoods, and this whole notion of connectivity. And then to Steve, this is such an exciting time for Hamilton. I'm a relative relatively new. I'm a resident. I've been here for 1 year, and I'm just kind of really falling in love with Hamilton. And with this plan, I think I'd be interested to hear a bit about the intersecting role of a public realm master plan, like with the buildings plan. What are the corresponding streetscape design guidelines that you might be thinking about? How do we make sure that there's room for trees, street trees, the human comfort aspect, to make the streets and sidewalks a pleasant place and an inviting place to get out and walk and encourage active transportation. So I have been looking at the plans online, and just interested to hear about the plans for the public realm and streetscape design guidelines, and how to make sure that it kind of all works together as an integrated set of guidelines that will really enhance the livability and walkability of the streets and the neighborhoods, and making connections, pedestrian connections.
A couple of things. One is, one that we wanted to look at was within the downtown area or within some of our special character areas to develop streetscape master plans that would essentially establish that vision for what would be a complete street and what would in or not in that complete street. So should it have street furniture, street trees, sidewalks, the width of those sidewalks, those sorts of elements. One of the things that I spend a disproportionate amount of time dealing with in the city, and I think Jason can appreciate this, are road widenings. Often we're asking for road widenings because we want complete streets, whether that be for on-street parking, street furniture, street trees, those sorts of factors. Generally within the downtown, we try to discourage road widenings. We've eliminated the need for road widenings, but there are some areas where we need to do that to achieve those complete streets from that consideration. The other aspect that we've been looking at is what's an appropriate building setback from the property line. Should it be 0? Should it be 1 meter, 3 meters, 4.5 meters, or 5 meters? To create that interface between that public space and the private space. Although you're walking down the street, you don't know where the property line is, you just know whether or not you enjoy walking down that street. So, and what are the different streets? So James Street or King William is much different than walking on Main Street. And how do you then make Main Street just as an attractive street to walk on as King William? So that's part of the aspects and one of the things that we are looking at, and very carefully when we're reviewing any of the development applications is that interface there at that public-private realm, and what is that pedestrian experience going to be like as we start moving forward on a go-forward basis.
Yeah, as you know, we all live in the moment that we live in with the realities that we're dealing with every day. But think about this. One is we are on the verge of a sea change with autonomous vehicles. Those autonomous vehicles will require much less space in the roadways. They'll require very much less space in terms of parking vehicles. And that's going to happen not 15 years, 20 years from now. It's happening already. So cities around the world are starting to think about what that means when we think about street design. You've probably heard of the Sidewalk Toronto project, where Google is coming now to downtown Toronto and looking at introducing new technologies. And so there are experiments, and they will be engaged in that, and others are engaged in that are thinking radically differently about street design. Before you even get to that, and this may seem like a paradox to you, as the population in downtown Toronto is increasing, we're actually narrowing streets. So we're doing an environmental assessment now to take lanes of traffic out of Yonge Street. On November 12th, we're doing a pilot on King Street to enable the streetcars to function and take out 2 lanes of traffic. And I've just come back from London, England, with a population many times that of Toronto, where they're way ahead of us and narrowing streets. Now, a bunch of other things happen as the cities get denser, and they're doing things that we have to look ahead to do. They have congestion pricing. So actually the traffic in London moves much more freely than the traffic in Toronto, which seems like a paradox, but they also have great transit. So we're struggling to get fare integration with Presto. They have an Oyster card, and between the buses, the tube, the trains, with one completely integrated fare system, you can get anywhere in Greater London very, very easily, and you would never think of taking a car because it would be foolish to do so. You'd never get there as quickly. That's tied into a level of information on your phone where you can stand on any street corner and say, I want to go to XYZ in the city, and you can see within minutes when the next available transit vehicle is arriving. You can get all the walking routes, you can get all the information about what's there. So I think in each city, we have to look ahead to the cities in Toronto that are more advanced than we are. You should be looking ahead to, there's a study going on in Toronto called TO Core, which I'm sure Steve and Jason are well aware of, which is what are all the collateral things that have to be done with the increase in density. So it's everything from hard services and utilities, it's the expansion of the public realm, it's additional transportation, so that you can stay ahead of that curve. So I think you have to have your thinking always pitched at a short-term, medium-term, and what are the long-term trends that you should be monitoring and thinking about.
Hi, my name is Renee. I'm with the Social Planning and Research Council of Hamilton, and my question is sort of twofold to both Ken and Steve about inclusionary zoning and affordable housing. So I'm interested to hear that Toronto's moving forward, given that the province hasn't really given us the full set of tools to work with. So it's very exciting to hear. I'm interested to know how you are moving forward, what percentage you're looking at, and Steve, how can we get moving forward on this a little more quickly, rather than waiting till it becomes an election issue next year?
So maybe I'll just give you an update. So after the province released the enabling legislation, we're still waiting for the regulations. The direction from council is to proceed with the moving forward with inclusionary zoning. So both planning and our housing divisions, we will be working forward. We're just waiting to get a little bit more clarification in terms of some of the material background information that has to be developed in order to bring forward an inclusionary zoning bylaw. Part of that is you have to do an update to your housing, basically the old municipal housing statements that we used to do, looking at our housing demands, what those needs are, have the consultation with all the various stakeholders, and then come forward with that and then an implementing bylaw to give effect to the concept of inclusionary zoning. Setting that aside too, when the province released the updated growth plan, like I indicated earlier, is now the province is giving much more direction for municipalities also to plan for the full range of housing types within the multiple dwellings in terms of bachelors, single, 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom, and 3-bedroom apartments. So that is all sort of the background work that we're doing that's going to then inform the update to our official plan, which will provide that sort of enabling framework at our local level, so that council can then make an informed decision whether or not to proceed on an inclusionary zoning bylaw. But the directions leading up to it over the last 5 years during the Planning Act reform and provincial policy statement reform and the growth plan reform was, council reiterated on numerous occasions to the province that we wanted the tools to provide for that full range of housing types, both in terms of whether it's a single, semis, or apartments, as well as the affordability range, and now we're adding that additional element in terms of looking at dwelling unit size. So that's part of our planning framework.
Yeah, I can't give you the exact numbers yet because the policy is being worked out, but I think what Waterfront Toronto has been doing as a kind of model on the Toronto waterfront, which is around 20%, would be a reasonable expectation. They're also not allowing people to do it off-site in some remote place. The whole idea is that these truly be mixed communities in close proximity. A piece of good news, I was just with Adam Vaughan, the parliamentary secretary who's dealing with the housing issue nationally. There are going to be some new announcements about additional federal support for inclusive housing, for affordable housing. The good news is after a hiatus of 15, 20 years when the federal government and provincial government got out of the affordable housing arena, we're starting to see both come back in. Clearly, in our case, there's a recognition, and you're in a slightly different situation, but to put it in graphic terms, anybody who was working in the service industry in downtown Toronto, people in construction, teachers, firemen, police, couldn't afford to live in the city, which was crazy. They were being forced to live further and further away, and so what's called workforce housing, which is not people in dire social need. These are people who have good jobs, who are no longer being able to afford to live in downtown Toronto. So this became something where everyone from the mayor on down recognized that something had to change.
Thank you. After this question, we'll have time for one more.
Hi, so I'm new in the industry, very new. And before I graduated from Mohawk, I noticed that that old church there on James Street, they ruined it and cut off the back, and they never built anything on it. I guess my question is like, when is that ever going to happen, or how would you avoid losing such a beautiful historical building in the future?
So I can give you what I know. The first developer went into bankruptcy, and then the receiver took ownership of the building. They advertised that, people wanted to buy the property and take over. Based on that process, the receiver has identified a preferred purchaser for that site. That purchaser is in the process of just doing their due diligence, but they are very committed to moving forward with that project as basically the original concept of preserving the heritage, the front portion as a heritage, and then coming and putting a new building at the back half. Basically, I think it was 30 stories in height, give or take. So they are committed to moving forward with that project. And hopefully, if all goes well, we might start seeing some activity on that site in December of this year, assuming that things get worked out. They have to do some geotechnical work and do some other, and then the new owners are very keen on doing an condition assessment of the existing building, making sure that it's stable, starting doing any restoration works, as well as relaunching the sales of that site. So I'm optimistic that we might start seeing activity there hopefully before Christmas of this year.
So this one, Steve, you get a pass on this one, because it's more of a political question, and I generally don't throw them at civil servants. But a great example there where Luke is. So James Baptist Church was not demolished, it was minorly altered, which had the same effect. And what I want to get to is, these are great plans, these are great processes, but how do we create process that also reflects politics? And I'm not referring just to politicians, I'm referring to developers, communities. How do we set a process that we actually follow? Because, when I go back looking at plans, we have great process, we have great plans, but then we all get political, and I say this to everybody, and then we don't follow them. So how do we set that up to make sure that we actually follow process?
So who's addressing that one?
Yeah, I'll answer that question with two words: civil society. And I'll give you the example of a meeting that took place this weekend in Toronto. I'm part of a new group that just convened called Waterfront for All. I would urge you to look at the website. People were starting to get concerned about things that were happening along the 46 kilometers of waterfront from Port Union and Scarborough all the way to the border of Mississauga. And so we brought together over 400 people to convene a meeting. There was just about 6 of us who said, we need to get people engaged and speak to their concerns around what's happening to our waterfront. Well, 400 people showed up, and guess what? A number of elected officials from all 3 levels of government decided to come. Senior civil servants, people from all the agencies decided to come, and we had a remarkable public discussion about the future. And the conclusion is, if the community is engaged, if it really provides stewardship, and let's face it, elections happen every 4 years, this long-term transformation that we're living through is the stuff of decades and generations. And so you really have to have an active, mobilized civil society that cares about the city, that makes its voice heard, that is not just dealing with one little neighborhood issue at a time, but actually is looking at a vision for the entire city, the city that you want to be. And I think you are Hamilton, you are in an extraordinary position now. I think the all-day 15-minute headway go service is going to be a phenomenal game changer. I think, you know, from all I hear and have seen recently, your city is going to become more and more attractive to more and more people for more and more reasons. And so you really have to get people involved in working with Steve and working with Jason, working with people in the other departments of City Hall, in thinking boldly about where this could take you and the kind of city you want to be, and expressing that in a way that the elected officials have to pay attention to what civil society is looking for.
I think one of the biggest shifts I've seen in the last 5 to 10 years is, you know, it wasn't uncommon that somebody would come in with an application or a site plan application, and they would say, you should be grateful that I'm making an application in downtown Hamilton. That day, that ship has sailed a long time ago, right? And now we're updating our plan. We're looking at, I think what Ken was saying, we're trying to project well into the future. That plan, actually, one of the underpinnings, though, that'll be for any infrastructure improvements that we have to make. So it becomes important, the decisions that get made. We also want to have forward-looking zoning. There's a criticism out there, I guess, in the greater Golden Horseshoe, that there's a lot of municipalities that don't have zoning that reflects today or going forward. It's very artificially low zoning, or it's unrealistic zoning. By trying to put together a plan that we feel is balanced, it's realistic, it's implementable with forward-looking zoning, that provides that framework. As well as saying, sorry, if your plan doesn't fit, it doesn't fit the framework, and hopefully with the changes through at the OMB and other provincial planning changes, that means that the community and council's decision on these applications, that's where it ends, as opposed to this OMB boogeyman out there where the developer can put millions of dollars, Ken probably knows better than I do, and the war rooms they put together really intimidate municipalities, and that they end up actually having to capitulate on something they otherwise would not have accepted because of the fear of the OMB and what it would mean for the municipality, or the precedent that they would lose control. So those are some of the issues that we've been trying to deal with. I think we've been trying to be very realistic with our plan, and we've been trying to, that's why we're important to community consultation, and that we have a plan that'll stick and should work going forward. I'm confident it'll work going forward, especially when we start underpinning it with those other public sector investments, i.e. like sewer and water upgrades, that then become very important in this development.
All right, well, thank you very much. That concludes our evening tonight, but before we go, I just want to thank Ken and Steve for their talk and their insights into, for Ken, both the work he's doing in many other cities and the work he's completed in Toronto, closer to home, and Steve for his insights on where we're going and a bit of our history of where we've come from too, because I think we really have to recognize that taking both the best practices and unique experiences that other municipalities have gone through, as well as understanding where we've gone through, those two combine together to create a solution and a way forward that's best for Hamilton. So thank you again, and join me in a round of applause.
Thank you.
And I'd also like to thank Laura McDavid and Anna Lanes, who have been working very hard.
Would you like to have my presentation?
And thank you